Good evening and a warm welcome to you all to the 2015 IISS Alastair Buchan Lecture. This lecture was established in the name of our first director to honor him and to provide an occasion for a leading personality to survey the strategic scene and offer reflections on how better to understand and navigate it. Many an Alastair Buchan lecturer has taken the opportunity to make a policy announcement or launch an initiative. A most famous example was the Alastair Buchan lecture delivered by Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of Germany, who sadly died last month, and he used the IISS platform to make the case for the deployment of medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe as part of what became the dual-track policy. Subsequent lecturers have come regularly from Western Europe and North America, frequently from Asia and the Middle East, as the Institute has grown to become a global organization, engaged everywhere and treating the full range of issues that can inspire or foreclose the use of organized military force. When the IISS was established, the great question the founders sought to answer was how to conduct civilized international relations in an era of nuclear weapons. It was at the IISS that much of the intellectual architecture of arms control and deterrence was developed and debated. In the beginning, no one quite knew how to think about nuclear weapons or how to control them, and so the task of the early leaders of the IISS was to help to determine ways to measure nuclear weapons capacities, the better to negotiate limits on them. In time, it became possible to manage a commonly perceived balance of power in the nuclear realm that would keep the peace, while the political forces of détente and ultimately glasnost and perestroika eventually pushed nuclear weapons from the delicate foreground to the steadier background of international strategy. Alastair Buchan, who in 1973 delivered the BBC Reith lectures on the theme Change Without War, would be pleased that in the 21st century the IISS was thriving. He would be intrigued to learn that again the IISS was at the center of the debate on how to understand a new domain of contestation, conflict, and sometimes even warfare, the cyber domain, and that again we were crafting ways of understanding this new domain and engaging policymakers in how to manage it. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the IISS quietly brought together negotiators from the United States and the Soviet Union to discuss nuclear arms control. In this decade, we bring together British and Chinese officials and scholars to discuss ways of managing the cyber domain. Today, we were delighted to launch a new IISS strategic dossier, Evolution of the Cyber Domain, the implications for national and global security. Perhaps in time it will be seen as a foundational text to appreciate the cyber domain in the same way as Hedley Bull's 1962 classic, The Control of the Arms Race, was seen as the key work to understand nuclear arms control. Given his keen interest in the eventual ending of the political divide in Europe, Alastair Buchan would be especially delighted to know that the IISS could receive the head of state of Estonia to speak here, and as a leader of a country firmly rooted in the political West and embedded in our principal economic and security institutions. Toomas Hendrik Ilves was born on December 26, 1953, to an Estonian family living in Sweden. He was educated in the United States, taking degrees from Columbia, and usefully gaining, given his later political preoccupations, a degree in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. He worked at Radio Free Europe in Munich, became Estonian ambassador to the US and Canada, joined the Estonian Parliament, initiated the Baltic Sea strategy later adopted by the European Union, and was elected as President of Estonia in 2006, re-elected for a second term in 2011. He has played an enormous role in the field of ICT, Information and Communication Technologies, as chairman of the European Cloud Partnership Steering Board, and in guiding Estonia to a position of global leadership in e-government and IT development. Fittingly, Estonia plays host to NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. Now you will have twigged as to why we chose this day to launch our dossier on the cyber domain. Yet while intrigued by computers from a young age, President Ilves' interests have ranged far and wide, and he has been determined that Estonia not be defined uniquely by its geography, or that the strategic concerns of the country be dominated only by the admittedly challenging issues of the immediate neighborhood. Small countries live and breathe interdependence, and President Ilves has been vocal in calling for intelligent responses to the crises in the Middle East and sympathetic responses to the migration problems facing Europe. He has been keen to remind societies in Europe of the dangers inherent in doing neither well. In general, in his early analytical, then diplomatic career, and as a leader of his country, he has thought and acted strategically. It is always our aim to find an Alastair Buchan lecturer who can do both, and so we were doubly delighted that President Ilves of Estonia accepted our invitation to deliver the 2015 Alastair Buchan Lecture. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that all too kind introduction. First of all, Estonia will not make any policy announcements on deployment of middle-range missiles tonight. Maybe some other time. And then perhaps to disappoint some of you, but we can leave it for the Q&A. Given the amount of time that I was given, I thought, okay, I'll leave my sort of personal favorite topic, which is IT security, Europe, IT, for the Q&A if anyone has questions, because especially in light of recent events, it just became impossible to squeeze it all in. But on the other hand, I'm very happy to talk about the cybersecurity and IT side if anyone has an interest. And I've seen some of my friends here who are from the IT world, then I'll do that as well if they ask. But for now, it's not part of this speech today. For nearly three quarters of a century, we have repeated the mantra of Europe as a project for peace. For the first part of 3/4 of a century, Europe, more precisely, half of Europe, thrived and grew under the protection of our transatlantic partner, the United States, even under the shadow of an aggressive totalitarian Soviet Union. For the past quarter century, in the absence of any external existential threats, we have pursued the integration of Europe to bring back to the fold those nations forced to live under communist dictatorship. Today, we're confronted with new existential, external, and as we were reminded in the Paris massacre just recently, also internal threats. And I think it's time we face the reality before us and around us. Europe is in a transformational crisis. A transformational crisis where we shall put to the test all that Europe has achieved. Transformational because European leaders are used to dealing with one crisis at a time, be it the financial crisis, Greek insolvency, the annexation or Anschluss of Crimea, and war in eastern Ukraine. Today, our desks and desktops are covered with crisis files. I won't even bring up UK-EU negotiations and the possible ramifications of that. Nonetheless, we must come out stronger than going into the formerly serial and now already parallel crises. So, ladies and gentlemen, today, first and foremost, if there's any agreement in Europe, it is that we face a refugee crisis. We are aghast when we hear the numbers. 1 million refugees and migrants to Europe this year, predictions of another 2 million in the next 2 years. Yes, these are very large numbers. Yes, they will strain social cohesion and they will stress our budgets. But also, let's put things in some kind of perspective. And let us return to the Europe of 1945, 1946. After the Second World War in Germany alone, there were 12 million internal refugees and another 12 million slave laborers, prisoners, and displaced persons of 20 different nationalities who spoke 35 languages. In the occupation zones, 15% of the British zone, the 15% of the population of the British zone, 18% of the American zone, and 24% of the Soviet zone were refugees. Hessen, with a population of 4 million, had 1 million refugees in it, so 25% of the population. And as late as 1949, already 4 years after the war, in Brandenburg, almost 700,000 refugees living there constituted 25% of the population. And I should add that my own uncle's family was in a displaced persons camp in Geislingen for 4 years, while my parents were among 30,000 Estonians who fled as erstwhile boat people to Sweden, fleeing both Nazi and Soviet ships trying to bomb those leaving. To deal with these challenges, at the time, 44 nations agreed in the middle of the post-war emergency to establish UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And to put things in greater perspective, the costs. In 3 years, UNRWA spent nearly $4 billion US. In today's money, in euros, this amounts to around 50 billion euros. So I guess you can do the math. You're more used to it than I am, what that means in billions of pounds. More than half of the budget was contributed by the United States. Today, that would be 33 billion euros, and the next largest donors were the UK with 8 billion euros and Canada 1 billion. The principal beneficiaries in 2015 euros were roughly 6 billion euros in Poland alone. For Italy, 5 billion euros, Greece, 4 billion, and Austria, 1 billion. I list these numbers illustratively to give us all a sense of some kind of sense of perspective, to understand how daunting a task was faced by our grandparents when Europe had no institutions, sometimes not even sovereign governments. And let's also keep in mind then that all I have outlined here from the immediate post-war years are concrete examples of the solidarity of Western countries toward Europe, which, with the exception of the UK, were not even part of the European Union of today. We must also keep in mind keep in historical perspective the crisis that we face in Europe today. So let's try to put our wits and gather our wits, combine our strengths to leave behind this constant indecision, finger-pointing, and ducking of responsibility. We can and will handle this migration crisis that we all face if we do something together. Now, while these foregoing facts and figures demonstrate how Europe has had to face far worse migration and refugee issues, and on a far greater scale than today, let us also recall why these measures, as well as the Marshall Plan, were enacted. It was to prevent a replay of the causes that led to the carnage of World War II. Today, we hear in the rhetoric of too many parties of the extreme right, and even as well as the extreme left across Europe, a chilling echo of those same 1930s. Calls for isolationism, a re-legitimization for the first time since the war of hatred, racism, and intolerance in the rhetoric of politicians. Some of these parties that we see are funded via dubious means from an authoritarian Russia. As we know, Front National has gotten 7 million euros from an oligarch in Russia. Some of these parties today sport symbolism that only barely tries to disguise its form, redolent of the swastika. These parties and politicians exploit the current refugee crisis. They exploit the economic crisis. They exploit the dissatisfaction of voters with the often anodyne and milquetoast resolve of European politicians. Voters crave responses to crises, and when traditional parties do not provide them, they look toward those whose rhetoric sounds decisive, yet carries within it this sort of, in quotes, decisiveness of reaction, of simple and not always very European solutions. This is yet another reason for Europe to respond through its democratically elected politicians, through its institutions, and through rule of law and respect for the agreements that we have made. This migration, I should add, also has revived old stereotypes of an Eastern Europe stuck in backwardness and xenophobia, a stereotype so many of us, from my country at least, have labored for so long to overcome. I do not want to see the momentous achievement of the EU's enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe undermined by this crisis. For all of us in Central and Eastern Europe are regular consumers of solidarity. We consume, at least in our three countries, air policing. All of us in Central and Eastern Europe have consumed borderless travel within the EU, the career and work possibilities across Europe. An entire generation of our youth has benefited from scholarship for studies abroad. I won't even get into cohesion funds, all of the infrastructure that has been built. The migration crisis is the first time since accession for the so-called new countries that serious solidarity and a significant contribution from our side is expected. My country will, and I hope others that have benefited so much from our return to Europe, will also reciprocate when Europe faces a crisis of this magnitude, a crisis that affects all of Europe. This is not to say the concerns and discussions in our public sphere are not to be taken seriously or into account. To the contrary, we have painful debates where various values either become mixed or clash with our tragic historical experience and with demographics. Fear is often understandable in our part of the world because of lack of experience and encounters with people from other religions and cultures. In this way, it is all quite different from our Western neighbors' experience, and thus demands careful attention and mindful considerations, not only by the media, but also at the negotiation table in Brussels. Ladies and gentlemen, exacerbating this, of course, is the horror of the recent attacks, terrorist attacks in Paris. Europe, in its reaction to Paris, needs less to say, we need more Europe, not less Europe, which is this mantra that, frankly, I don't think anyone can take anymore. And instead, do more to take seriously our security and our defense. The Paris attacks must bring us closer together in the EU and not make us drift further apart. The goal of the ISIS, Daesh, ISIL terrorists is to intimidate the West, to terrorize us, to desist from seeking to end the violence of Assad, as well as the barbarism of ISIS itself. To terrorize us enough that we will close down our free and open societies, to lead us to forsake compassion and solidarity, and to sow dissension and discord among us, so we would be forced to refuse refugees from war, to force us to close down our free and open societies, and to renounce our Enlightenment heritage of liberal democracy. At the same time, the attacks in Paris have brought back into focus the principle of collective defense. An attack against one is an attack against all, a principle even more relevant in a Europe of open borders. Only together can each country defend itself against terrorism. This presumes international cooperation and increased defense and intelligence cooperation in Europe, something we have talked about so much but done so little about. We must, long after the establishment of Schengen, I know UK is not part of it, but the rest of us, finally establish the sine qua non of a Europe without internal borders. That is, external control of, or rather effective control of the European Union's external borders. We must know who arrives in Europe and why they arrive. Laxly controlled, or worse, uncontrolled migration flow represents a fundamental threat to our citizens' security. Europe must find better ways to make sure we know who is who. Yet we must not close the door to those who truly need help. Europe must take care of its security, but Europe must not give in to fear. Yet, there's one more dimension to consider, the challenge, that is, in the challenges facing Europe's defense. Some 25 years ago, a certain European foreign minister proclaimed in the middle of the Yugoslav crisis, and I quote, "This is the hour of Europe. It is not the hour of the Americans." Yet, as we remember, Europe did nothing, and indeed it did take the Americans to stop the killing in Yugoslavia. This time, however, we do not have the luxury of inaction in this new crisis. Today, we wonder, at least some of us, is this the hour, Europe's hour? For today, we're far more on our own than a quarter century ago, and we face multiple challenges. We have a Russia that calls for a coalition against one of our enemies, ISIS, yet the same Russia itself has violated every major European security treaty, beginning with the UN Charter to the 1975 Helsinki Final Act and the 1990 Charter of Paris. It has violated or destroyed as well the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity in return for eliminating what was then the world's third largest nuclear weapons arsenal. Or will we say that the conflict between civilization and barbarism is so fundamentally existential that we must suspend the rules that have underpinned Europe's security since World War II and accept aggression, occupation, and annexation, which, as we know, were the proximal causes of the Second World War? Are grave and fundamental violations of the international law underpinning our security secondary, lesser evils compared to terrorism? As we all know from Europe's history, turning a blind eye to aggression leads to far greater tragedies in the future. We cannot allow yet another replay of the Melian dialogues that the strong does what he wills and the weak do what they must. We will not abide the argument that sensitivities of the stronger ones should be prioritized over the sovereign decisions of the smaller or weaker. Might in the 21st century of Europe does not make right. Independent countries, no matter what their size, must be able to speak for themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, in many ways, all of this recalls, again, the immediate post-war years when Europe didn't quite fathom what was going on as country after recently liberated country fell to a new form of totalitarian rule, communist takeovers. Then it was British leadership that saved Europe, at least the western half. It took a British statesman who, by 1980s, 1990s, and 21st century standards, had a most curious pedigree, if we look at how people on the left have thought in the last 30, 40 years. Let me quote. "We had hoped that the method of international agreement would be allowed to work, but it has not been allowed to work, and so what should have been a great experiment in post-war international collaboration has only been a continuing source of friction and bother." That was the British Labour, I stress, Foreign Secretary, I stress it because some of our other social democratic friends in Europe don't really know their history. who said on January 22nd, 1948, in the House of Commons, in a speech in which he insisted that the democracies of the West organize in order to protect themselves. This, if you know your history, was the beginning of NATO. Soviet bullying in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and other Central European states, in Greece, and even Norway, if you know that, I mean, which when they wanted to get a non-aggression treaty with the Soviets, or Soviets wanted one with Norway, showed that the agreements of the initial post-war settlement, less than 3 years after World War II, had led a left-wing government to push for a transatlantic link that would come into being a year later. Some of my Nordic colleagues might reflect on that. It was their socialist comrade in the 1940s who decided to lead in the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Today, in many ways, we're in a similar position. We see the treaty-based post-Cold War settlement unraveling. We see the occupation of parts of Georgia and Ukraine. We see, on a daily basis, transponderless military flights in the Baltic Sea, where we've had many near misses with civil aviation. We see mock attacks against Northern European countries. The question is, who will be our era's Ernest Bevin? Because finally, ladies and gentlemen, it all comes down to leadership. Faced as we are by a sea of troubles, by ISIS, migration, populist demagogues of the far left and right, exploiting these crises and exploiting the justified anxieties of our electorates, we must defend our free and open societies, not only against outside enemies, but also against our own fears and our own reactions. This requires leadership, something that the pre-crisis years often did not demand of politicians. The willingness to take a stand that looks beyond the next Gallup poll and the next by-election. Leaders that can resist populist pressures and easy economic gain. And even more importantly, leaders that can navigate between the shoals and rocks of fear and isolationism, to stand up for freedom, to find an equilibrium between security and freedom. If we do not find within ourselves the leadership that is a sine qua non of the creation of a unity of Europe, if we do not take a bold stand against all that violates the underpinnings of Europe, we will have to say, almost 3/4 of a century after Winston Churchill's 1946 speech calling for a united Europe, that we have failed. If, on the other hand, we find the resolve and courage of the founding fathers of the EU and of NATO, of those who after the Second World War came together to deal with challenges far greater than any of those that we face today, then we stand a chance. So let us admit this is a transformational crisis. Let us accept that history calls upon us, those entrusted to carry on the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, to be decisive, to be united in our resolve. For we cannot forget that Europe remains a beacon to those nations that in the past quarter of a century have striven and in many cases succeeded to join Europe, to those who have risen up for liberty in Europe's name, to use Timothy Garton Ash's description of the universal quest for liberté, égalité, and fraternité. To all those for whom Europe's rebirth from the ashes of war and mass murder gives hope that it can be done. It can be done. Europe has overcome far greater challenges. If, however, we do not rise up to these challenges, future generations will look back at us and say we have failed, that we squandered our European inheritance, and they will ask why we did so little when so much was at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you very kindly agreed to take questions. The President's remarks, by the way, are on the record, as will be his answers to questions. I thought it interesting, just as a passing comment, that last week, after many weeks and months of proclaimed Russian incursions into the territorial airspace or sea space of a number of northern European countries, there was a NATO southern flank member that took action to defend its territorial integrity, though I don't know whether Turkey was self-consciously acting as a NATO country when it did so, but it was probably, in general, a good thing for a future sense of NATO solidarity that a NATO country did, in fact, take action when it perceived its airspace to have been invaded, as it were, by the Russians. I wonder, given your huge emphasis on the importance of political will, on the need for European and NATO solidarity, what hope, as an analyst as much as a political leader, you place on the prospects of a European strategy that will be established in 2016 by Federica Mogherini, or on a NATO strategy that will emerge out of the Warsaw Summit, of these two institutions, of which Estonia is a relatively recent member? What do you now look to in terms of the way they should comport themselves in this new security environment?
Well, again, I have no prescriptions, but I would say, number one, the NATO summit really must come back to deterrence. In the 1990s, the mantra was everything is solved. I mean, all that remains basically is getting some countries into the European Union and into NATO is largely a mop-up, cleaning up operation because we won the Cold War. And as you recall, Richard Lugar, famous article saying out of area or out of business. We have slowly come back to area because we realize the problems have not been solved. But the key issue here is, I think, deterrence. That really is, deterrence first, then dialogue, kind of the Harman sort of approach. A lot of people suggest, well, let's have dialogue and then we can have deterrence. Basically, I think one of the problems we face is that too many people think dialogue is a policy. Dialogue is not a policy. It can be part of what we do, yes, but it is not the end, and is not the solution. Especially if you're speaking from a position of weakness rather than of strength, or at least minimally equality. On the European Union side, given the reluctance of the European Union to actually engage in any kind of use of force, I think the onus will really be on strong defense of external borders. And all kinds of measures associated with that, slipping into the cyber or IT side of things. I think we really need to be able to identify people. We must offer, or we must insist on adequate identification of people and basically make services and movement contingent upon a verifiable identity of one form or another. I mean, that's where I think IT can actually help us a lot. And I'm not going into the details at this moment, but we need to know who is coming. I mean, I said this in a sense in my speech, but we need to really know who it is that is there, to be able to identify who their family members are they legitimate, so we can look at them when they show up somewhere. Are they the people, really the persons with the identification that they carry? All of this is actually technologically very simple, but it does require some kind of serious action on our part, and it must be done by Europe as a whole. I mean, it is not enough to do it in one country and you don't have it elsewhere, especially when you have open borders. So I think that we also need to use the developments of the past 10, 15, 25 years in technology that will enable us to solve these problems. But I would say the fundamental issue for the EU is to really have a very strong external border.
Thank you very much. First question here. Yes, I've seen your hand here, not to worry. I've got you, but you first.
Yeah, Ronald Freeman, Atlantic Council of the United States. Mr. President, if Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin should take it into his pathological head to invade your beautiful country, are you confident in invoking Article 5 of Lead Your Friends from NATO to Estonia's rescue?
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, well, I'll explain that. In that, you know, the minute
The question was about Article 5.
the minute Article 5 failed, there is no more NATO. I mean, that's really it's one failure and the organization is gone. Because after that, no one knows, and there is no, you lose deterrence, you lose the confidence that, the other side, whoever that may be, says, oh, well, it didn't work there, let's see where else it doesn't work. And the countries that, and I can't see a country saying, or a government saying, no, we won't do Article 5, knowing that that means next time someone will say no to them. I mean, I'm not that part, there's so much speculation on that issue, and I really can't see that happening because of the consequences for the entire alliance.
Thanks very much. The next person will just wait until the microphone comes. Yes, in the fifth row, the gentleman who's had his hand up all the time. Your question can be shorter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm the former UK Customs Intelligence Analyst for the new EU member states and the ex-Soviet Union. And my question is based on a post-service project when I visited Estonia. And I would just say, if anybody wants to see how to understand and develop the professional monitoring of the external border, they really should have a Skype, a long compulsory Skype with the gentleman who was head of the border guards in Narva in April-May 2012, and with the police HQ in Tallinn, outstanding professionalism. But my question is, you've partly addressed it, do you see any signs that the European Commission is starting to modify the view which you pointed out of avoiding issues which might involve force? And in other words, that they are starting to think, not act in a military way, but start to think in a military strategic way about the problems we all face, and problems which you've explained now. Thank you.
Well, I would hope it would be Skype, since it was invented in my country. But, it's... the European Commission can only go so far. It really is when defense remains, as the UK knows well, a national prerogative, and there are countries that really don't want to fight or want to avoid fighting. I mean, one of the reasons why I always feel comfortable in the UK is that, like the UK, we do 2% of GDP on national defense. We have been, without caveats, in the worst parts of Helmand, together with the UK. We may be small, but we do what needs to be done. Now, there are other countries that don't do what should be done. Even, it's not only the EU, but even within NATO, that shirk the commitment to defense spending, that sit out things that allies do, or go in with caveats. Say we don't shoot unless we're shot at. I mean, there are attitudes like that in NATO. We're not even speaking about the European Union. Now, when it comes to basically EU doing anything, I mean, we're hampered by this this problem that maybe might be resolved under the threat of terrorism migration. I mean, in one hand, you have, because of the political problems, and when it comes down to it, is the island of Cyprus. On the one hand, you have Cyprus and Turkey are at odds with each other since 1974. And anytime there's talk in the EU of cooperation with NATO, Cyprus says no. And Turkey does the opposite. As soon as there's talk in NATO of cooperation with the EU, Turkey says no. It comes down to a political problem in one place in Europe, and until we get that resolved, it's going to be very difficult to get cooperation. On the other hand, what this leads to, I mean, I'm going too far afield, but basically, we have a split brain problem, if you know the sort of studies of brains being split. Your two halves of the brain can't talk to each other if you're a defense minister. If you're a defense minister in a country that's both in NATO and the EU, you go to Justus Lipsus, the building where the council meets, and you can talk about European defense. You are forbidden to talk about it when you then drive with most of your colleagues over to NATO headquarters. I mean, you can't, and you as defense minister, under you are the same tanks, the same planes, the same troops. But there is no real dialogue, except in a very sort of structured way, and not too often, between the EU and NATO. I don't think it's a way to run anything. But until we get these political problems straightened out, it's going to be that way. I do hope that that realizing the massive, how great the threat is to our countries, that we can come to some kind of terms. I hope that the recent meeting between Turkey and the EU will perhaps take this somewhere. And similarly, we need to talk to all of our friends to say, look, we cannot continue this way. We cannot defend Europe if we don't talk the two organizations that are most relevant to European security and contain largely the same people, can't even talk to themselves.
You see why I mentioned that I thought a degree in psychology was useful preparation for contemporary strategic problems. Nick Redman, you stand, as you know, the microphone will soon come to you. I've got the others here.
Thank you. Mr. President, you answered a question just before about Article 5 in the context of a military attack. But I wonder if you think there is potentially a lacune in Article 5 as it currently stands, because unlike Article 4, it has the phrase armed attack. If you look at some of the other threats that could face, that could emanate, whether in the cyber domain or in a combination of low-level measures that we now use the rather inconvenient shorthand hybrid in order to explain. Is there a problem there, do you think? And are you in favor at least of having a discussion in NATO about dropping the word armed from Article 5?
Well, as we've seen today, we've seen in the last 10 years, the term is a non-kinetic attack. Which is a kind of useful thing. But we know that an armed attack. Let's put this way. The Department of Defense in the United States 4 years ago already said we need not answer a cyber attack in the same domain. Meaning, if you attack us, you can disable a power plant or blow up a power plant, as we know, or at least centrifuges you can blow up with Stuxnet or some kind of with some kind of thing. You don't have to respond, or the U.S. and we don't have to respond in cyber. We just send a rocket. So I don't think the armed thing is something to get too hung up on. Cyberspace is weaponized, and once it is, and if you agree it's weaponized, which I think most people do, and you can inflict huge damage through, in using electrons, then armed, I think it becomes a moot point. On a hybrid war, I have a real problem with this. This is, today is the 91st anniversary of a Soviet-run coup attempt in my country that had all of the same elements as the takeover in February 27 of of 2014 in Crimea, sort of troops massed on the border, troops sort of masked, taking over the, at that time, telegraph station. I mean, basically the same operation. So I always find, just simply because Gerasimov wrote an article in 2013 calling this hybrid war, we don't have to take that over. I mean, they've been doing it all along. I mean, they've been doing it at least, I mean, my country saw it in 1924 on December 1st. If you look at the takeover of the Baltic states in 1940, and if you look at the takeovers of East Europe, which Anne Applebaum has written brilliantly on, thank you. I mean, the same descriptions, hybrid war, would apply. He said we didn't call it hybrid war. I mean, after Valery Gerasimov called it hybrid war, it's hybrid war. And then you see all the massive, because they have a new strategy. No, if you know your history, you know this is nothing new.
Yes, you first. Go ahead. We'll just wait for that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. John Ellison, member of the IISS. Do you think, Mr. President, that the alleged insecurity felt by Russia due to the eastward expansion of NATO is genuine? I'm thinking not so much of Estonia threatening Moscow, but perhaps some of the former Warsaw Pact countries, plus suggestions in the last American administration from John Bolton that Ukraine and Georgia and countries like that should be admitted to NATO.
I think sort of a fear of NATO is instrumentalized to keep an attention on this external threat. I mean, if you look through this post-World War II Soviet period, I mean, you mobilized the country by saying we're going to be attacked any moment. We're going to be attacked any moment. NATO's going to come and attack us. And people lived in this sort of environment, you know, practicing constantly running just first, I mean, civil defense shelters and so on. This bête noire of NATO expansion, if you actually look at the map, I mean, it's actually the amount of border that now has NATO on Russia's border is rather small. I mean, it's not really a big issue, but I think it's used to great effect. Now, Ukraine, I mean, the point is we have all these countries, including Ukraine and Georgia, part of a series of treaties, most importantly, the Helsinki Final Act and the Paris Charter, that said every country can decide its own security arrangements. Well, we've already, I mean, so they should have the right, if they want, and if they meet the requirements for membership to join. I mean, it obviously requires the permission, or I mean, the approval of other members of NATO. But there is no droit de regard regarding these countries. And all of the security arrangements that have been proposed from Russia, beginning with the, interestingly, July 2008 idea that they would then, Russia would have a veto over future enlargements of the EU and of NATO, down to the speech by Vladimir Putin at the UN in General Assembly this year, lamenting the loss of the security architecture between East and the West forged at Yalta. I mean, when we think of the crumbling of the security architecture of Europe, I don't really think about Yalta falling apart. But nonetheless, I mean, there is this, I think it's used for, it's, how should I say? I mean, it's used domestically to create a climate of fear, and then occasionally it is repeated by what Stalin called useful, or Lenin, I guess, called useful idiots. I won't mention any names, but you do hear occasionally people saying the same thing, and generally they really don't have much of an understanding of, what is what. Sorry.
Yes, in the, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4th row, yes, with the glasses. Thank you. And then we'll come up in a second. We'll get to you.
James Roberts from the Tablet. Mr. President, thank you. I wonder if you could turn your mind back to Turkey again and the agreement between the EU and Turkey over refugees, giving Turkey several billion euros to keep refugees in Turkey. I wonder whether you think, first of all, is that a wise thing? Do you think that it's reignited the accession talk to some extent, I think. Would you hope that those would go further or not?
Well, my country has never really had issues with Turkey. In fact, you know, if there is, when we, I even gave a speech about 4 years ago, that if in the standard development literatures there's an expression for which is getting to Denmark. I think if I gave this at the sort of in the middle of the Arab Spring, but I said, well, basically, you know, getting to Turkey would be a pretty good solution for the post-uprising or post-spring countries. I mean, basically, yes, we can always criticize Turkey for a number of issues, and Europe does, but I would rather see the Islamic world a Turkey rather than any other forms that we currently see. So I'm quite favorably disposed towards Turkey, and I think, you know, a country that should have begun negotiations in 1964, and this is 51 years later, I think we've actually behaved less than respectfully toward a country that, you know, I mean, the treaty says if you're in Europe, and, you know, sorry, you cross the Bosporus, you're still in Turkey, you're in Europe. As I said, I'm very favorably disposed, and I've always been towards Turkey. And I, you know, obviously we can say, well, they have this problem, but then almost all countries that have joined the European Union have had one or another kind of problem that they say, well, look, you got to solve this, then we'll let you in. I think we should take the same approach to Turkey and not take an a priori Huntingtonian position that liberal democracy is not possible unless you come from Western Christianity.
Yes. We'll take a couple more and then we'll bring it to a close.
No one's asked about IT, cyber.
I know we'll get that.
Ali Bahajub, North-South Publications. Mr. President, following the attack last week against the Radisson Hotel in the Malian capital, Bamako, the Germans, or Germany actually, has decided to send 560 troops to help the French on the ground. Do you support the formation of a European deployment force as it stands today? And the second question, if I may, if the UK decides to withdraw from the European Union, would that change the political landscape in Europe? Thank you.
Oh, you want a short answer? Well, first on Mali, we've been in since 2013. We've been in Mali, I mean, Estonia has been in Mali since 2013. We just yesterday signed, along with the UK, Norway, Latvia, Lithuania, the Joint Expeditionary Force Agreement. So we, as I said earlier, we do things. You know, we do go, we do spend. We have troops on the ground. We have boots on the ground where necessary because we think it's something that needs to be defended. We have a more recent experience with sort of what lack of freedom means than some other countries. So, I mean, in terms of would we support, obviously. I mean, we have. I mean, to give you another example, tiny Estonia is in absolute, not even relative, but absolute numbers, number 7 in spending on, or number 6, on Frontex. I mean, when you think about countries like that, as small as Estonia, and you know, far more than all, I mean, if we look at per capita, then we're by far number 1. But I mean, we believe in defense. Well, you know, the problem with, I mean, that big question you asked is that, you know, we would, from a strictly national interest point of view, the UK represents on so many fundamental issues a view that is very close to ours, be it defense, again, a willingness to actually defend, a willing to spend on defense. I mean, there are not too many countries that do 2% of GDP. UK does, we do, Poland does, France, more or less. Close, but it's good to be close even. And then on other issues, clearly when it comes to the digital single market, we're almost on the same page, if not on the same page. Free movement of services. I mean, we're Estonia, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, and the UK are all part of this northern liberal, economically liberal tier. And you know, if you add all of those countries up without the UK, we're rather weak, or rather, we're not a heavy power then. But if the UK, with the UK, where we're so like-minded on things, and not just now, but I mean, I remember during the Bolkestein directive debate, I mean, we were on the same page all the time, and it was, you know, Estonian socialists, Estonian conservatives, Estonian liberals, and UK, British socialists, or Labour, British conservatives, liberals. We're all like in one group saying we have to do this thing to liberalize services across borders. And then you can see it was not a part of the political, it wasn't as if it was left and right, because then you could go to some large unnamed countries, many large unnamed countries, and there you saw, you know, the socialists and the social democrats and conservatives all unanimously against free movement of service across borders. So, I mean, in answer, we would be very, very unhappy, and domestically and also within the EU, considerably weakened by a departure of the UK.
In the second row, yes, if you.
Mika Kerttunen, Cyber Policy Institute, Tartu. Mr. President, with your permission, an ICT-related question. Given your description and diagnosis of the European crisis, I'd like to hear your elaboration of the role of ICTs as a cause or a solution to this problem.
Well, I would say more broadly that Europe is going to basically turn into a museum if we do not develop a single market when it comes to digital services. Right now, we have 28 separate markets. We have 28 sets of intellectual property regulation. We have, I mean, the 28 factorial numbers of VAT problems that need to be solved. Unless we do this, Europe will be nothing but a museum for rich Chinese and rich Americans to visit and vacation in. We have 500 million, we always talk about that. We remain in a position where it's easier to ship a bottle of wine from the Algarve to Lapland in Tornio than it is to buy an MP3 file across between Tallinn and Helsinki. It's, we don't have that. The US has a single market of 330 million. We have 28 markets. The largest one is 82 million. We're not going to go anywhere. And in fact, the other side is we're going to lose our best and brightest. Virtually every European country, soon as someone does well, I mean, someone has a smart idea, they move to the US. Because A, the market is so small here, and B, there's really the financing possibilities. Capital markets in Europe are really at a low stage. In the US, it's 80% private financing, 20% banks. It's the other way around in Europe. Banks look at a 24-year-old and say, what have you done? And private equity looks at a 24-year-old with a neat idea and says, go ahead, here's the money. And I tell everyone, and some people have heard me say this multiple times, you know, mea culpa, but I had a personal experience, and I read 4 years ago, a 24-year-old Estonian, recent graduate of the Technical University, had gotten $300,000 for a startup. And so as president, I try to encourage young people who do like stuff like that, and I invite them to tea. And so he came, we had tea, and he said, well, sorry, Mr. President, but in 2 weeks I'm moving to the United States. I He said, okay, why are you moving to the States? He says, well, look at the market, come on. And then, and I can get money there. I said, okay. And then 6 months later, he had 4.6 million invested in his company. Last October, so 3 years after he gotten his 300,000, he sold his company for $100 million. Now, this would not be possible in Europe for a 24-year-old Estonian kid to end up like that. It's not possible in Europe, let alone Estonian. I mean, maybe in the UK, that's possible. I mean, because the UK has a large enough market, has a fairly sophisticated capital, has a capital market scene. It's still 60 million versus 330 million. But if we don't do this Europe-wide, we're going to fail. And the final number is, of the 20 top IT companies in the world, the first, or 14 of the top 20 are American, and the rest are Chinese or Indian. I mean, we're not a player unless we deal with this. And I think it's just as, I mean, if we do not have a single market in Europe, then all this other stuff and all of our other concerns will be, I mean, we can do something, yes, but if we don't, if we can't maintain our wealth and develop it, we might as well see people, all our brightest will move elsewhere. And they won't move to China, you know where they'll move.
I didn't plan it this way, but I think the last question from David Buchan, son of Alastair Buchan, and really happy to see the family represented here. David.
Well, David Buchan, a member of the Institute. This might be a cyber-related question, but given your robust views of Russia, does it concern you that Estonia and the two other Baltic states are still linked to the Russian grid, electrical grid, and not to any other?
Well, we're taking steps to get out of that, and have been doing this consistently, and this, of course, bothers our Russian friends no end, but it's a long process to disengage. I mean, it's a technical process, but certainly we need to do that, and it is a security issue, so we'll do that.
Mr. President, thank you very much for three things. First, a great speech, for a very practical, no-nonsense style, and thirdly, for engaging in what has been a conversation one doesn't normally get to have with the head of state, but in the spirit of the IISS, we've enjoyed so much having you here. Thank you very much for the visit, and please, I hope everybody will show their recognition of the President of Estonia for their wonderful activity.